Okay.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah. So I'm going to preface this by saying I've got 2 slides and just about 2 hours worth of material. So buckle up. No, I've got, there are 2 other presentations, other workshops that we have done in the past. I'm going to drop the links to those YouTube videos in chat because what I'm going to give you here is really high level. Also understanding that you all come from an audit background. A lot of this isn't going to apply directly to you because it's kind of taking some of your outputs and looking at how we turn those into a bot. So I'll try to gloss over those as necessary. So let me just walk you through what an engagement has looked like for us. Hopefully you can't hear my 5-year-old daughter singing in the background. It's beautiful, by the way. So the first thing that normally happens as the development team or the monitoring team, we will receive an audit report and any monitoring recommendations. Andy referred to the compound, the most recent compound audit report. So that's a good example. You can read that whole audit report. It's all public. And then you can see the monitoring recommendations at the end of it. We review the entire document. We look at the monitoring recommendations and say, okay, these make sense. Also, potentially add our own monitoring recommendations to it. We did in that case as well. And then if we have the opportunity, we go back and forth with the audit team to make sure we understand what they're mentioning and get some clarification. As far as requirements, one thing that hasn't been mentioned yet, maybe it was mentioned in your previous workshop, is we go through each of those requirements or each of the recommendations, and we try to generate like what is really required of this. If some of those things are very common tasks, like an event was emitted or a function was called, there's actually a bot wizard, which is a great way to get started because it's basically a declarative way. It's got a good front end on it as well, but it's a declarative way to say, this defines my bot, and boom, you're up and running. You've already got something that will do all that filtering for you. Also things like what is the value of a variable from block to block and does it change, stuff like that. So if it's a very common task, as I'm calling it, there are some good templates out there. You should probably start there. They're good references to begin with. Most of the time, they're going to be more specific tasks that are going to be kind of protocol specific, right? Like each of these smart contracts operates in a different way, unless they're all Uniswap clones, in which case we just need to know how Uniswap works. And so that could be things like assessing value like TVL, or is a liquidation possible, stuff like that. So just try to identify those. What are you really trying to do? You guys are no strangers to the documentation of the smart contracts, so I'll skip over that part, but that's really critical, obviously. And then we create our kind of initial concept for how we're going to monitor this thing with what's at our disposal. As far as development is concerned, we need to look at all the resources we have at our fingertips. I can't recall who just asked, but about off-chain data. So what are on-chain data sources? What are off-chain data sources? Do we need to use an external API, or can we get it all done with on-chain, which is really what we prefer because that is kind of the source of truth for all of these things. We developed some initial heuristics for how do we meet this condition. You guys are probably already thinking through that as you're going through your audits of like, how would I break this thing, or how would it be broken? Then we need to figure out, well, what's the threshold for that heuristic that's kind of the go, no go, like something's bad, something's critical, or something's just okay. And then for us, we then go back to the project team, the audit team, possibly the community, and basically just say like, are these the conditions that you're looking for? Again, you guys probably have that in your head already. Testing, this is really probably the most important step. So I think Stephen was the one who mentioned back testing. That's absolutely critical. If you have transactions that you can refer to where these things have already occurred, that's the gold standard. That's not always going to be the case. For instance, if you're trying to make a bot for an exploit condition that you hope never happens, well, you're going to have to generate some kind of synthetic data. And so that's where these positive and negative test cases come in to check for that functionality. It's difficult to avoid the temptation to get the kind of false sense of security that my test passed, therefore this bot will work, especially in the case where the thing should never happen, right? So it's like, well, it didn't raise an alert, so we must be good. Meanwhile, somebody's money's being stolen or something like that. So if you want to go ahead and go to the next one, I can't emphasize testing enough. Testing is probably where we spend most of our time. Review, you guys work on teams just like we do. So, get your own stuff in order, and linting and code formatters are fantastic because we all have our different styles, our different ways that we like to write code. And in the end, we need to, we need to kind of get that to a thing that other people can digest quickly. Especially as you guys look at a lot of code optimization and smart contracts. I'm sure you appreciate when people use more standard methods for things. As a team, we then do the standard code development process. So pull requests, you need somebody to approve this thing. Don't just merge it in, although I'm guilty of that. I think I have the GitHub badge for it as well. But that's a very critical step. Publish, I won't go over that too much more because Hasib already showed you like, okay, this is how you publish, but that can be you doing it. That can be the project team, the community, somebody needs to own the thing. They're also going to be the ones who maintain it. Be sure to document the bot ID when you publish it, and then publish that bot ID so that your team, the community, whoever else can monitor it as well. People who want to subscribe can. And then rather than you having to actively go in and check for what the bot is doing, the bot can notify you if you do subscribe to it via email, Slack, whatever other supported methods are present. Check out those alerts, make sure that they look like what you expect. Follow up on the concerning ones. You guys are audit teams. I'm sure you do that already. And then note any improvements you can make. And then the maintenance step, which is kind of like rinse and repeat of a lot of these other ones, is looking at what your bot is returning and saying, is it returning way too much? How can I improve this heuristic to be a little more fine-tuned? Is there anything that's missing from the alert? I know a few months ago, Forta put in place this addresses field in findings, which is a way to basically say, here are all the addresses involved in this transaction. You can populate that yourself. So you can say, here are the addresses that should care about this alert. And then they have built some things on top of that so that people who subscribe can basically filter by an address that they're concerned with, hopefully their own. And then, also fixing bugs, adding features or whatnot. And then something that we've had to do more recently is, as a project team or a community makes more requests like, hey, I like this thing you did. Can you also check for this? Or can you modify it to send an alert on this particular event? This, unfortunately, there's not an end to this really. We're still trying to figure out how to hand off some of the ownership of these things to the parties that care, the parties that should care the most. But that, in a 5-minute nutshell, is 2 hours worth of videos. So with that, I'm sure I missed a lot. I'm sure there are questions. Does anybody have some? I will mention this, though. I took some notes while you guys were talking. We did make a bot that did some pending transaction stuff. I do not trust that as a mempool processor. You definitely need to go find another data source to get the mempool stuff. I think it was Nikita who asked that question. I do not view the Ether's provider.on pending as a sufficient method to say this is like the mempool. So you definitely need to find something else for that. As far as historical data is concerned, I'll offer one more in addition to what Stephen offered. If your bot needs to digest everything since block 1, one way we've discovered or that we've come upon that is helpful is run your bot locally and have it run for whatever it's going to take, 10 minutes, 30 minutes, however many logs the thing is pulling down, and export your results as a CSV or a JSON formatted file or something like that. Because Forta bots are Docker images, you can package that. And I know Steven's going to hate me, especially if it's like a gigantic JSON blob that you're shipping with it. But within reason, if you're shipping some succinct representation of what you need, that can actually go with the image. And then when your bot starts, it doesn't need to start at bot 1 again. It can now start at whatever block that data ended off. And now you're just talking about loading a file locally and then kind of kicking off from there. That's definitely something we've had to do for things like liquidatable positions where borrows happened back at the beginning and we need to keep track of everybody who's ever borrowed a thing. Also, if you have a long-running process that's never going to finish in the 15, well, I guess it's like 13 seconds of block time, you can consider making an async function that gets kicked off by the block handler. And then while that's running, as the other blocks come in, you can just return empty findings. And once that async function has actually returned something, you can then say, okay, here are my findings. Yes, it's 10 blocks delayed, but at least I was able to finish the entire task. We recommend finding a way to do that that doesn't involve taking forever, but there are some things that are like that. You will have limitations on the providers that you use. Hasib mentioned the Cloudflare provider. That's helpful because you don't have to enter anything. But if you do have an Alchemy API key, or if you have your own node or Infura or whatever else, if you're trying to really get a lot of data out of one of these providers, you're probably going to hit a limit. So for instance, I think Infura limits logs to 10,000, limits a response to a get logs request to 10,000. So if you exceed that, you're going to get an error. So be aware of that. And I don't think I can stress this one enough, that testing from the command line, super duper helpful, right? There are some other tools we use that run elsewhere, and it is more difficult to troubleshoot them, to test them, to refine them because of where they run. And so we've actually ended up kind of emulating what the Forta agent package has, which is kind of building a scaffolding around it locally so that we can take that resource from the cloud where it's running, bring it down, and kind of wrap it in what looks like almost a Forta agent wrapper to get transactions into it. And that is a really, really good way to debug your stuff. And one last point is that I think, Stephen, you may have mentioned state. One of the useful things, because you are running in a Docker image or in a Docker container when it's running, is you can store state from one block to the next. And that can be in memory in your JavaScript or your Python, whatever process. You can store it locally inside your container, again, with some constraints. But being able to store state and execute, like those two things together, that's a pretty powerful combination. And that's something Forta offers that some of these other platforms for monitoring might not give you. They might give you execution, but you might have to figure out state on your own or something like that.